woman was sitting on the curb outside the Greenvale bus station when Sergeant Marcus Cole first saw her. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel temporary, a thin gray sky pressing down over the parking lot, the pavement still wet from overnight rain that had not quite finished deciding to stop. She was thin in a way that was not natural. Wearing a man's canvas coat 3 sizes too large, her gray hair pulled back with a piece of cloth that might once have been a bandana. She was not holding her cardboard sign-up. She had it leaning against her knee the way someone leans a thing against a wall when they are too tired to hold it anymore. She was looking at the ground. Beside her, pressed against her left leg with the quiet alertness of a dog who has decided this human is worth guarding, was a small brown terrier mix with one ear bent sideways, sleeping with one eye open the way small dogs do when they do not entirely trust the world. Marcus almost walked past her. He had a bus to catch, a duffel bag over his shoulder, and exactly $14 in his wallet. A bus ticket would carry him 300 miles north to a town he had not visited in 11 years, where a woman named Dottie Hargrove had left a telephone message 2 weeks ago saying she needed to speak to him about his father. He almost walked past. His German shepherd, Ranger, stopped first. Ranger was a 6-year-old working shepherd, 78 pounds of muscle, and amber fur with a black saddle marking, and he had 2 specific registers of stillness. There was the stillness of a dog at rest, complete and boneless, a deep canine wakefulness that Marcus had come to rely on as a signal that nothing was wrong. And then there was this other stillness, ears lifted, weight forward, nose working. The subtle lean that meant something here deserves attention. Ranger stood on the wet pavement outside the Greenvale bus station and looked at the woman on the curb, and Marcus, who had learned over 3 deployments to trust that lean before he trusted anything else, stopped walking. If this story has already found its way into your chest, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss what comes next. He stood there looking at her. She still did not look up. The small terrier opened both eyes and regarded Ranger with the wary dignity of a much smaller dog who has decided no size differential will change the terms of his pride. Ranger watched him back, calm, neither threatening nor retreating. Then the terrier laid his head back down, and Ranger sat. Marcus reached into his wallet, stood there a moment with the $14 in his hand, then folded 10 of them and crouched down to the woman's level and held them out. She looked up then. Her eyes were dark brown, clear in a way he had not expected. The eyes of someone simply exhausted and without options. She looked at the money and then at him and then at Ranger, and Ranger was sitting with the quiet weight of a dog who has determined that this person is known. "I can't take that," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's too much." "Take it," Marcus said. She looked at him again, not at the money, at him. Her face moved through several small changes, the way a person's face does when deciding whether to trust something they haven't been given reason to trust in a long time. Then she reached out and took the $10 and held them in her fist. "I knew a man who walked the same way you walk," she said. Marcus straightened up. He had a bus to catch. "Most people walk pretty similar," he said. "No, they don't," she said. "Not like that." She reached into the pocket of the oversized coat and brought out an envelope. It was a standard white envelope, worn at the corners as though it had been handled many times. It had a name written on the front in blue pen and handwriting he recognized instantly and completely, the way you recognize a sound from your own childhood. A creak in a specific stair. The handwriting was his father's. The name on the envelope was his own. He stood on the wet pavement outside the Greenvale bus station and looked at his father's handwriting on an envelope in the hand of a woman he had never met. And for a moment the entire world went quiet in the way it goes quiet before something breaks. "Where did you get this?" he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "From a man named Daniel Cole," she said. "He gave it to me 4 months ago. He was outside the Millhaven shelter on a Tuesday night. He said if I ever met a tall man with short dark hair and a big shepherd dog, to give it to him." She looked up at Marcus steadily. "He said I would know him by the dog." Ranger had not moved. He was sitting on the wet pavement with his amber eyes on the woman's face, perfectly still, perfectly certain. Daniel Cole had been dead for 6 weeks. Marcus had gotten the call during a training exercise in an empty field, stood in the cold and listened to the coroner's assistant tell him that his father had passed quietly in his sleep at a residential care facility, said thank you and hung up the phone and gone back to the exercise because there was nothing else to do. He had not gone to Millhaven. He had not been back in 11 years, not since the argument. Not since the door closed between them the way doors sometimes close, with a weight that feels permanent. He took the envelope. His father had been 59 years old when he died. He had been a carpenter for 30 years, a man who built things slowly and well, hands thick-fingered and scarred at the knuckles, always with dried sawdust in the creases of his palms. He had raised Marcus alone after Marcus's mother passed when Marcus was 7, in a small house on the edge of Millhaven, with a wood shop in the backyard where he spent his evenings building furniture for people who could pay modest amounts and a few who could not pay at all. He showed up at 4 in the morning when neighbors' roofs were leaking. He fixed things before he was asked. In Marcus's long and complicated estimation, he had been a better man than Marcus had ever given him credit for while he was alive to receive it. Marcus sat down on the bus with the letter in his lap and did not open it for 40 minutes. Ranger settled at his feet, his large head resting on the aisle floor, his amber eyes moving between the window and Marcus's face at measured intervals. Marcus's breathing had changed. The dog knew. He had left Millhaven at 22 after the argument that ended things. It was not a complicated argument in retrospect. He had enlisted without telling his father first, and his father had said things that were not entirely untrue, but were delivered without the softness that might have made them land differently. And Marcus had said things in return that he had spent 11 years being unable to unsay. He had sent a card at Christmas for the first 3 years. After that, the silence had accumulated the way debts accumulate. Not dramatically, but steadily, until it weighed enough that opening the channel again required an effort he could not find the shape of. He opened the envelope somewhere north of Greenvale, when the highway had left the city entirely, and the hills had begun to show themselves through the window, brown and patient, and still faintly dusted with the last of the winter cold. There were 2 pages, handwritten. His father's handwriting, small and deliberate. The same handwriting Marcus had grown up watching fill out receipts and job orders and Christmas cards. The pen pressure was lighter in places, as though the hand had tired. He read it slowly. He read it twice. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It did not rehearse the argument. It said that he had spent years after Marcus left trying to be angry, and had found he was not good at sustaining anger, which had always been one of his failings. It said he had kept the newspaper clipping when Marcus was promoted to gunnery sergeant, mailed by a former neighbor, and that he was proud in a way he had never been good at saying because his own father had not been a man who said such things. It said he had been at a place called the Millhaven Rest Haven Residential Home for 2 years, which had decent staff and a window that looked east. It said he had a few things he wanted Marcus to have: a set of hand tools in the wood shop, a box of photographs, and 6 acres on the Carver Road that he had bought 30 years ago and held without purpose, because he had always thought that one day there might be a use for it. The deed was in a lockbox at the Millhaven Savings Bank, number 47, and the key was with a woman named Dottie Hargrove on Pembroke Lane, who had held it in exchange for fixing her porch stairs. He said he had written the letter 3 times, and this version was not right either, but it was the best he was going to manage. At the bottom, in slightly heavier pen pressure, "I know you were right to go. I know I was wrong to say it the way I said it. I spent a long time being the man who couldn't say that. I am saying it now, late and in a letter, because I am better at wood and words on paper than I ever was at words out loud. You were made to do what you did. I should have told you so." The bus arrived in Millhaven at 4:15 in the afternoon, the light already going amber and horizontal the way late afternoon light goes in the hill country when the year is tipping toward spring and the cold has lost its conviction. The station was a single-room building with plastic chairs and a vending machine, and the town outside was the same 9,000-person wait it had always been, the same 2-lane Main Street with the hardware store and the diner and the Methodist church on the corner. Marcus stood outside with his duffel and his dog and looked at the town for a moment. Ranger sat beside him, ears up, reading the air. Dottie's house was on Pembroke Lane, 7 blocks from the station, which Marcus walked in the cooling afternoon with Ranger at his left side and the letter folded in his jacket pocket. The address was a name that meant nothing to him yet. The name of a woman his father had trusted enough to hold a key. The house was a white clapboard 2-story with a front porch repaired recently, the boards bright and new against older painted wood, the kind of precise work a carpenter does rather than a general contractor. There was a flower bed along the porch, railing cleared and turned for spring, the dark soil raked smooth, waiting. A lamp burned inside the front window in the dimming afternoon. The woman who came to the door was 71 years old, a compact 5'3" with white hair cut short and practical, wearing a corduroy vest over a flannel shirt, her hands in her vest pockets, the way a person's hands rest when they have been busy all their life and are only temporarily standing still. Her face was deeply lined, the skin bronzed and lived in, her eyes the pale blue of glass worn smooth by weather. She looked at Marcus, then at Ranger, and a complex series of things happened in her expression that settled into something that was not quite relief, but was in the same family. "You must be Daniel's boy," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. She opened the door wider. "Come in out of the cold, both of you." Her name was Dottie, and she had lived on Pembroke Lane for 43 years, had raised 2 daughters in this house, had buried a husband named Gerald 12 years ago, and had known Daniel for 22 years, which she mentioned while putting a kettle on the stove with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who has understood for decades that information and tea are best delivered simultaneously. She said Daniel had first come to her attention because he had fixed her fence after a windstorm without being asked, had simply appeared one morning with lumber and spent 4 hours at it and refused payment, which she had found infuriating and then, over time, admirable. She said he had been a fixture of Pembroke Lane and surrounding streets for 2 decades, the man you called when something was broken and the hardware store estimate didn't bear thinking about. Ranger lay down under the kitchen table and watched Dottie with the calm, steady attention of a dog who has found a person acceptable. She set a mug in front of Marcus and sat down across from him with her own. She said that when Daniel moved to Rest Haven, she had visited him every 2 weeks, which she described not as kindness, but as what you do for people who have been decent. In the last year, he had mentioned Marcus perhaps a dozen times, not with complaint, but with the flat tone of a man describing a door that was closed and that he hoped to see open before there was no more time. She had driven him to the bank on the day he put the lockbox together and held the key since, just as he had asked. "He wasn't sure you'd come," she said. Marcus wrapped his hands around the mug. The tea was too hot to drink, and he held it anyway. "He didn't know if you'd gotten the message from the care home about his passing," she said. "He wasn't sure if you still had the same number. He wasn't sure about a lot of things toward the end." She paused. "But he was sure about a few." "What was he sure about?" Marcus said. "That he was proud of you," she said. He said it so often and stopped sounding like something he was working out and started sounding like something he'd accepted. The way you accept weather. Just a fact of the world. Marcus looked out of the window. The amber light had deepened. Ranger shifted under the table, pressed his flank gently against Marcus's boot, and was still. "He built a lot of things while he was here," Dottie said. "Things for people on the street, porch stairs, a ramp for Vera Caldwell's husband when he came home from the hospital in a chair, shelving for the church pantry." She turned her mug in both hands. "He never stopped working. Right up until he moved to Rest Haven, he was always working. He said it was the only thing that felt true." The kettle had stopped its noise, and the kitchen was quiet in the way houses go quiet in late afternoon. Marcus thought about his father in the wood shop behind the house on the edge of town, the lamp burning over the workbench, sawdust on the floor, the sound of a hand plane moving with the grain. He thought about sitting on an overturned bucket, watching that when he was 9 years old, watching the ease of a man who understood what he was doing and why. That ease had always seemed to him like a kind of wealth, not money. Something more reliable than money. "I'd like to visit the house," Marcus said. "The house on the edge of town, where we lived." "I know the one," Dottie said. "It sold 4 years ago. Young family from down south bought it. They've done well with it." She paused. "The wood shop is still there. They kept it. The man of the house uses it, your father's old tools and all." Marcus nodded. "The land on Carver Road is yours," she said. "I have the key. The bank is open tomorrow at 9. He nodded again. She looked at him for a long moment with those worn glass eyes. "You look like him," she said. "Same way of going quiet when you're thinking." He stayed that night at the Millhaven Motor Inn on the highway side of town. A clean, modest room that smelled of industrial cleaning solution, with a heater that clicked inside. He sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in his hands and read it a third time. Ranger lay on the floor watching Marcus, with the amber eyes that never entirely stopped attending. Marcus thought about the woman at the bus station in Greenvale. He thought about her carrying the envelope for 4 months, waiting for a tall man with a shepherd dog, not knowing if he would ever come. He thought about his father pressing that envelope into her hands on a Tuesday night, the confidence of it, what it meant to trust the world that much, after everything. He turned off the light and did not sleep for some time. The Rest Haven residential home sat on the east side of Millhaven, a low 2-story brick building surrounded by mature maple trees, just beginning to show the smallest promises of spring buds, the branches winter bare, but with a quality of waiting that felt different from dormancy. Marcus arrived in the morning after the bank, the lockbox key in his pocket alongside the property deed. He had not planned to visit the care home. He found himself driving toward it anyway. The woman at the front desk told him that several of the staff remembered Daniel with warmth, and she called a woman named Beverly from the activity room. Beverly was a stout woman in her mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the patient manner of someone who has spent a long career being present at difficult moments. She told Marcus that his father had been a popular resident, that some people made a residential home feel smaller, and some made it feel larger, and Daniel had been emphatically the latter. He had fixed 3 chairs in the common room that management had been planning to replace. He had taught a wood-carving group on Tuesday afternoons, using a set of small tools he had brought with him. In the last months, when his hands stopped cooperating with the fine work, he had sat in the group anyway and talked the other residents through the cuts, which Beverly said had been, in her assessment, more valuable than the carving. "He talked about you," Beverly said. "He said you were a Marine. He said you were good at your work." Marcus looked out the window of the activity room at the maple trees, their bare branches precise against the pale morning sky. "He said he wished he'd said that to you," she said, "while he could." Marcus thought about saying something, and did not. Beverly walked him down the hall to the room that had been his father's, now repainted and waiting for a new resident, anonymous, holding no trace of the man who had lived in it. At the end of the hallway there was a small alcove with a wooden bench, narrow and well-made, with a carved panel depicting a hillside and pine trees in simple, confident relief. Beverly stopped at the bench. "He made that," she said. "In the first year, when his hands were still good. He said it was for anyone who needed to sit down for a minute." She paused. "We've left it because it seems wrong to move it." Marcus stood in front of the bench. The carving was unhurried. The trees spaced the way actual trees space themselves. Nothing stylized, just an honest representation of a thing that existed in the world. He put his hand on the back rail, on the carved wood. Ranger sat beside him, ears forward, and pressed his shoulder gently against Marcus's leg. He drove out to Carver Road that afternoon with the property deed in his pocket and Ranger in the passenger seat. The window cracked enough for the dog to read the air as the truck moved through the hill country. The 6 acres were at the end of a gravel lane off the main road, unfenced, the land rising from a flat lower field into a wooded slope where pine and birch grew close together, and the ground was still soft from snowmelt. He stood at the edge of the field and looked at it. The field was overgrown, but not ruined, the kind of neglect that a season's work could undo. At the top of the wooded slope, the land leveled briefly into a clearing, with a view east that stopped him, a long, unobstructed fall of hill country, to a pale horizon, where the sky began to lighten at its base, even at midday, as though the distance itself carried its own light. His father had bought this land and held it for 30 years without doing anything with it, except own it, as though keeping it intact were itself a form of building. Marcus stood in the clearing and turned and looked at what 30 years of waiting had preserved, and felt something shift in his chest, not dramatically, but with the quiet, irreversible movement of something large settling into a new position. The pressure he had been carrying since the coroner's call shifted its weight in a way that did not make it gone but made it different, carried instead of dragging. Ranger walked the perimeter of the clearing the way working dogs walk a new space, systematic and thorough, reading what the ground remembered. Then he came back to Marcus and sat down beside him, and looked east at the same view. They stood there for a long time. Back in town that evening, Marcus stopped at the Millhaven Diner, a narrow building with a red awning and a counter that ran the length of the front window, where a woman named June Presley had run the evening shift for 23 years. June Presley was a compact 62-year-old with silver hair and a braid down her back, and the unhurried competence of someone who has been excellent at a job for a long time. She recognized Marcus, which startled him until she explained that she had known Daniel, and that Daniel had shown her a photograph once, years ago. She put coffee in front of him without asking. She told him things as she worked, the way diners work, in passing between other tasks. Daniel had eaten breakfast at the diner every Saturday for 15 years until Rest Haven. He had fixed the diner's back door so quietly that June hadn't noticed until she tried to lock it one night and found the lock worked. Several weeks after he moved to Rest Haven, 3 separate people had stopped in asking how to reach him because they had jobs for him and no way to find him. This town ran on him in ways it didn't notice until he was gone, June said. She set a plate in front of Marcus without him having ordered. People like that don't leave a lot of noise. They leave gaps. After dinner, Marcus walked back to the motor inn in the dark, the town quiet around him, the streets lit by sparse orange street lamps. He thought about the woman at the Greenvale bus station, the envelope in her pocket for 4 months. He thought about the chain of it, the specific kind of faith that leaves a letter with a stranger and expects the stranger to know who to give it to. He thought about Ranger stopping on the pavement outside that station, the lean that Marcus had learned to trust before he trusted anything else. He called Dottie that night from the motor inn, sitting on the edge of the bed in the lamplight. "I'm going to stay a while," he said. There was a pause on the line. "How long's a while?" Dottie asked. Marcus looked at the window at the dark outside. "I don't know yet," he said. "However long it takes." "Takes for what?" she said. He thought about the clearing at the top of the wooded slope, the view east. He thought about the carved bench in the hallway at Rest Haven, placed there for anyone who needed a minute. He thought about his father's hands in the lamplight of the woodshop, moving with the grain. "There's land that needs work," he said, "and some other things." Dottie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He would have liked hearing that." He did not say anything to that. "There's a community breakfast Saturday morning at the Methodist Church," she said. "People would like to meet you." "All right," Marcus said. He went to the breakfast on Saturday. He had not intended to stay long. He arrived at 8 and left at 11:30, having been introduced to 41 people in approximately that order. Among them a retired deputy named Harold Stokes, who had been a friend of his father's for 30 years and who wanted to talk about the land on Carver Road. Harold Stokes was 67 years old, a rangy man with white stubble and the steady, unhurried eyes of someone who had spent decades reading situations before entering them, walking with a slight favor in his left hip, from an injury he described only as old business. He said he had known the Carver Road parcel since before Daniel bought it, had walked it himself, knew the soil and the slope and the clearing at the top. "Your father used to say that land was for building something that would outlast him," Harold said. "He didn't say what." "He didn't know," Marcus said. Harold looked at him steadily. "Maybe he just needed the right builder." Ranger had been sitting under the folding table beside Marcus through the breakfast, accepting attention from children who crouched down to pet him, and the open admiration of older men who knew what a working shepherd looked like. When Harold reached down to let Ranger sniff his knuckles, the dog leaned forward and pressed his muzzle into Harold's palm, with the uncomplicated warmth he reserved for people he had already decided about. Harold laughed, surprised by it. "Well," he said, "good enough for me?" Over the following weeks, the shape of what Marcus was staying for began to clarify. He walked the 6 acres on Carver Road a dozen times in different lights and weathers, watching the slope drain and the flat field dry. He sketched things in a notebook, rough and impractical, the kind a carpenter's son makes when working out a problem before committing to anything. He talked to Harold over coffee at June's diner and to Dottie over tea in her kitchen and to a man named Pete Vasquez, who ran the lumber yard on Route 9 and had built 3 structures in the hill country in the last decade and knew the soil and the permits and the particular stubbornness of the county planning board. Pete Vasquez was 44, a wide-shouldered man with dark hair gone gray at the temples and hands almost as scarred as his father's had been, a carpenter's son himself, which he mentioned once and did not mention again because it had done its necessary work. He walked the land with Marcus one afternoon in early April, the maple trees delivering on their promise of leaves, a pale green warmth over the whole slope, and said the flat field was buildable, the slope drainage manageable, the clearing at the top the kind of place that did not come along very often and should not be wasted. "What did you have in mind?" Pete said. Marcus looked at the clearing. Ranger moved through the tall grass at the edge of the tree line, ears working, nose to the ground. "Something small," Marcus said. "Something that stays." He had been thinking over those weeks about Beverly's description of his father in the carving group, talking others through the cuts when his own hands no longer cooperated, about Harold's comment about the right builder, about what June had said about the gaps people like his father leave, about the woman on the curb in Greenvale, sitting with a letter for 4 months on nothing but faith. He had been thinking about what you build with faith when you have it. He filed a permit application with the county in the 3rd week of April. The application described a workshop building with a covered porch, approximately 1,200 square feet, designed for shared use by a community crafts and skills program. The planning board approved it in 6 weeks, which Harold told him was unusually fast and which Marcus attributed to Dottie appearing at the board meeting with a prepared presentation that suggested she had been thinking about this possibility before he had. They broke ground in June. Pete came with 2 of his crew on the first day and would not discuss payment for the labor until Marcus had already insisted twice, at which point Pete accepted an amount that Marcus understood was significantly below market and did not argue with. Harold showed up on the second day with a truck full of reclaimed oak flooring that he said he had been keeping in his barn for 10 years, waiting for the right floor, which he donated without discussion. June organized a meal rotation that ensured hot food arrived at the site every day at noon and at 5:30, carried by a different person each time, which meant that Marcus met nearly everyone in Millhaven, who was the kind of person who shows up with food when something good is being built. Dottie came one morning in late June and stood at the edge of the site, looking at the framed walls going up, the beams his father's tools had shaped in another context now being used in this one. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "He would have wanted to do this himself," she said finally. "I know," Marcus said. She turned and looked at him with those worn glass eyes. "He did do it," she said. "Just in a different order." Marcus looked at the framing. He did not say anything. The building went up through the summer with the patient accumulation of a thing built correctly, the sills level and the joinery tight, the covered porch facing east the way his father had always preferred his windows. Marcus worked alongside Pete's crew every day, relearning things his hands had partially forgotten, the particular satisfaction of physical work that gets measurably more complete with each day, that can be seen and walked around and understood. Ranger was on site every day, working the perimeter in the mornings, accepting water from any hand that offered it. The day they hung the front door, Pete stood back and looked at the building and said, with the understatement of a man who does not give compliments cheaply, "That's a good building." Marcus looked at it. The light was coming from the east at that hour, long and level, falling across the porch boards. "Yeah," he said. It is. By September, the building was finished, and the community program had 6 enrolled participants, from a 16-year-old boy whose high school counselor had suggested the program to a retired machinist named Arnie Beckett, 70 years old, whose arthritis had ended his shop work, but who wanted to stay near tools and wood for reasons he did not need to explain. Marcus ran the Tuesday sessions himself. He was good enough to teach the basics, and Harold came most Tuesdays, and Pete came once a month, and what the program had that formal instruction sometimes lacks was patience and time, and the particular atmosphere of a space built for exactly the purpose it was serving. He thought about the Tuesday group at Rest Haven sometimes, standing in the new workshop with wood shavings on the floor and the sound of a hand plane moving with grain. He thought about his father sitting at the table when his hands stopped cooperating, talking people through the cuts. Some things get passed from one person to the next without the passing being deliberate or visible, the way a work ethic passes, the way a preference for east-facing windows passes, the way the understanding that showing up is itself the most important cut. In October, Marcus drove to Greenvale on a Saturday morning. He had found the woman through a network of connections that took 3 weeks, ending with a woman named Carla from a transitional housing program, whose name for the woman on the curb was Frances Beaumont. Frances Beaumont was 63 years old, had lost her apartment 18 months ago after a medical crisis, depleted her savings, and had been navigating the shelter system since. The small terrier's name was Biscuit. Marcus found her in the transitional housing unit on Desmond Street, where she had been placed 2 months earlier, a tidy one-room apartment with a window that faced a courtyard. She answered the door with Biscuit at her feet, and she looked at Marcus and then at Ranger, and her face did the thing it had done on the curb outside the bus station, moving through several small changes before settling into something quiet. "You opened it," she said. "I did," Marcus said. She nodded once, the single slow nod of someone confirming something they had already made peace with. He had brought things, a bag of groceries chosen with care, practical rather than symbolic, an envelope with money, enough to help without overwhelming, and a card with his phone number and Dottie's number, and the address of the workshop on Carver Road, because he had been thinking about what skills a 63-year-old woman with steady hands might have that the Tuesday group might benefit from. Frances looked at the card for a long moment. "He knew I'd come," Marcus said. "My father. He knew I'd come back." She looked up at him. "He talked to me for a long time," she said. "That night, outside the shelter. He was not a man who needed to say much, but when he said things, he meant them." She paused. "He said his boy would know what to do with the letter." Ranger moved forward and sat down in front of Biscuit. Biscuit studied him with the skeptical dignity he had applied to their first meeting, and then, apparently satisfied, touched his nose briefly to Ranger's. Ranger sat with his amber eyes half closed, perfectly at ease. "The dog," Frances said, watching them. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Your father said that too. Said the dog would know." Marcus stood in the doorway and thought about chains of trust, about the specific faith required to pass a letter to a stranger and believe it will arrive, about the way a man better at wood and words on paper than words out loud had nevertheless managed to say what needed saying. He thought about the cleared field on Carver Road, the workshop with its covered porch. He thought about Dottie's face when she said he did do it, just in a different order. The drive back to Millhaven took 4 hours in the late October light, the hills going amber and rust, Ranger with his nose to the cracked window. Marcus drove without the radio, thinking about what he still needed to do to the drainage on the lower field before the ground froze, about the second carved panel Pete had suggested for the workshop wall, about the November community breakfast where June had said there would be a few more people she wanted him to meet. He thought about reclaimed oak flooring that had waited 10 years for the right floor. He thought about his father standing in a shelter doorway on a Tuesday night, pressing an envelope into the hands of a woman he had just met, certain enough in the order of things to trust that the chain would complete. The turn for Carver Road came up in the early evening, the light fading to that blue-gray of October dusk that sits just at the edge of cold. Marcus turned without deciding to. The way you turn down a road that has become familiar before you noticed. Ranger lifted his head. He parked at the bottom of the lane and walked up to the workshop in the near dark just to stand in it for a minute. The porch faced east. The building sat square and level on the flat field. The tools his father had left him were on the wall in the order that made sense to the hands that would reach for them. He stood on the porch with Ranger beside him and looked across the land his father had held for 30 years, and felt the thing in his chest settle further, not into absence, but into something with weight and shape and room to stand on. He stayed there until the stars came out over the hill country, patient and cold and numberless, the same stars his father had looked at from this same ground for 30 years of quiet waiting. Dottie's kitchen light was on when he passed her house on the way back through town, warm and amber in the blue October dark. He slowed and stopped without entirely meaning to, and I went up the porch steps and knocked. She opened the door with the unhurried air of someone who is not surprised to see a person they expected. "Supper," she said. "If there's enough," Marcus said. "There's always enough," she said, and opened the door wider. Ranger went past her into the warm kitchen with the ease of a dog who has decided that this is a place he belongs, and settled under the table in his customary spot and was still. Marcus stepped inside, and Dottie closed the door against the October dark, and the lamplight fell across the kitchen table with its 2 mismatched chairs and its worn surface, and its smell of good food and warm wood, and Marcus Cole, who had been moving for 11 years and had not called any place home since a night when a door closed between him and his father with a weight that felt permanent, felt something open. Something was here. Something had been held for him, patient as land, patient as a man who was better at wood and words on paper than words out loud, patient as a dog who knows things before the humans do. He sat down. Finally, home. If you have stayed with this story until its last line, you understand something about the way goodness travels. It does not always travel in straight lines. It goes through the hands of strangers, through letters folded into coat pockets, through dogs who stop on wet pavement when something deserves attention. It travels through land held without purpose until purpose arrives, through floors that waited 10 years for the right room, through a man who could not say the thing out loud and found another way to say it, and trusted the world enough to believe the saying would reach where it needed to go. The chain that connects us to the people who shaped us does not break when they are gone. It only changes the shape of how it holds. If someone in your life has been building something for you that you have not yet recognized as being built, may you have the eyes to see it. And if you are holding something in a pocket for someone who has not yet come back, may they come back. May the dog stop. May the letter arrive. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring you home to every place that has been waiting for you.